Shalom, dear friends. This is you. And in Israel, we're beginning an era of celebrating the period of time between Passover and the Pentecost, the Shavuot. In these days, we celebrate the day of the redemption of the city of Jerusalem, the unity of the city of Jerusalem. We celebrate the holiday of Independence Day, Israel's 72nd Independence Day. This year we'll be celebrating it on the 29th of April. This year's 29th of April, we will be celebrating Israel's Independence Day. Also, on the 30th of April, we will mark 100 years for the San Remo event, the San Remo convention, where actually we can say it's a major milestone in the history of the return of the people of Israel back home. It was the decision of accepting, and I would say even officially announcing that the state of Israel will be born. I know many people are familiar with the Declaration of Balfour. Many people are familiar with the partition decision by the United Nations. But exactly in 1920, April 30th, or from April 19th till April 26th, from April 19th till April 30th was the convention of the San Remo, and there they announced, officially accepted the Declaration of Balfour. But today, as we are living in a time which is a time of the return of the people of Israel back home, I want to study together Psalm 107. We spoke, shalom, Andrew from Malaysia. It's so great that you're here with us. And we're studying today, Andrew, Psalm 107. You're welcome to open the book. It begins with a very famous verse we spoke about last week. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki l'olam chesdo. Give thanks to the Lord because He is good, for His kindness is eternal. And let's see what the story is telling us about. Those who were redeemed by the Lord, who Yomru Giulei Adonai Asher Gis, and gathered them from lands and from east and west, from north and from sea. They strayed in the desert. Now here we have the list of people who have gone through suffering, and let's see who they are. And the first one is in verse 4. Those who strayed in the desert on a road of desolation. They did not find an inhabited city. So the first people who are thanking God are those who got lost in the desert. The second, we're in verse 9. He saved a yearning soul, a hungry soul. He filled with goodness. Those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, prisoners of affliction and iron. These are people who are suffering from illness. These are people who are suffering from illness, and they are also those who are praising God. Why are they praising God? Once again, it says in verse 13, they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and from their straits He saved them. He saved them, and they shall give thanks to the Lord for His kindness. So we saw those who are lost in the desert, and those who are ill. And now we have the third group, for he broke copper doors and cut off iron bars. These are people who are sitting in locked up in behind iron bars. People who are in jail. And these people also, verse 19, they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and He saved them, and He brings them healing. And the fourth are those in verse 23, those who go down and sea in ships, who do work in mighty waters. So these are four people that are thanking God. We are in Psalm 107. Four kinds of people that are praising and thanking God. Shalom Beverly from Texas. Thank you for joining us. So these are four different people. We are studying together Psalm 107. We saw that the Psalm mentions four different kinds of people. Four people who are suffering, different kinds of suffering. Those who are lost in the desert. Those who were down in a ship. those who were behind doors and bars, and those who were ill. And these all, in the beginning of the psalm, he begins strangely, Hodu ladonai kitov, give thanks to the Lord because he is good. Those who were redeemed by the Lord, and in verse 3, and gathered them from lands of isolation, from east and west, and from north, and from the sea. So here we see that we're talking about the redemption. We're talking about people who were redeemed. What are we talking about? What is the redemption process that we're talking about here? And if we look carefully, it says those who God gathered from all over the world, from east and from west, from north and from sea. And these are people that were gathered by God. So why are we talking about people who were lost in the desert? Why are we talking about people who were behind bars? Why are we talking about people who were ill? And why are we talking about people who were down in the ships? If we're talking about those who were redeemed by God. If we look at the structure of this prayer, we see the four people. They are in sorrow, they're in depression, they're in a situation of distress. They call out to God, and he saved them. But then it says, and from verse 33, it has a description. He makes rivers into desert, springs of waters into place of arid, a faithful land into salty waste. So he's talking about a land. He's talking about a land that was also suffering. He's talking here about a land that was in dry, that was like a desert. And the land itself became a place of springs of water. It also says about the people in verse 37, and he settled there the hungry there, and he established an inhabited city. And they sow fields, and they plant vineyards, and they produce fruit and grain, and they blessed them, and they multiplied exceedingly, and their animals also did not decrease. And here we're talking about something very great. Here we're talking about that God has redeemed the land and settled the people there. And so what is the connection between the two parts of these four different kinds of people and the story described in the end of the psalm? What is the psalm talking about? And I think that we who have lived and seen the miracles of the past generation, we understand that the psalm here is actually a psalm of prophecy. It's describing the process of redemption. What other nation was scattered all over the world and came back home? What other land was deserted and became a land flourishing with trees and water and fruit? Of course, we're talking about the land of Israel and talking about the people of Israel. And maybe there are those who think that the process of return is going to be something easy. But we know that the process of these four different kinds of people is part of the process of the return to the land. Those who are lost in the desert, those who are ill and they almost reach the gates of death, those who are lost in the ships. These are four kinds of people, four kinds of ways of description of the distress of people who are in the danger of death. And after they yelled out to God, God saved them. These are what we see. Those who are walking in the paths towards the return of our exiles back home. It's hard to say that. I can even say that sometimes when we think of this, our heart refuses to believe. But the psalm, the poet here prophesied what things that we saw and not very many generations ago. We saw, let's read, I just want to read out, and if we look at these things here in a description of from the eyes of what we saw in our generation. I'm reading, for instance, we can read, let's see, let's read, for instance, I would read here. Let's read here. Verse 10. Shalom from Poland. Shalom J. Jeko. I'm reading verse 10 in Psalm 107. Those who sit in darkness, in the shadow of death, prisoners of affliction and iron. Do we not see with our eyes those death camps? Do we not see the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who were sitting there in concentration camps? Isn't this a description of them sitting in darkness, in the shadow of death, prisoners of affliction? And it's no surprise that this would next week, the beginning of next week, we will be marking the Memorial Day for the Holocaust, because this we see as part of the process. The poet here, I'm sure, he didn't even understand how his prophecy is so strong and describing those who were saved. We see the horizon of the prophecy in this psalm. So many different people who had to find their ways to come back home to their homeland, to the land of Israel. Coming back home to their homeland. There are very few people who in those days actually understood that they're going through a biblical period of time. And it all began right after First World War with the Declaration of Balfour and with the San Remo Convention, where they announced the accepting of the fact that there will be a Jewish state and that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, will be able to come back home to their homeland. And every one of these went through a distress. And he went through the crying out to the Lord. Vayizaku el Adonai, verse 13, for instance, they cried out to the Lord in their distress, from their straits. He saved them. God saved them. When we read about the walking in the desert, we know that the Jews who came back home from Ethiopia, they walked through deserts days and nights. Many of them got lost on the way. Can there be a better description of what it says in verse 4? They strayed in the desert on a road of desolation. They did not find an inhabited city, hungry as well as thirsty. Their souls enwraps itself in them. And they cried out to the Lord in their distress. Shalom, shalom, Anthony, shalom for your blessings. And they cried out to the Lord in their distress. He rescued them. He rescued them. He brought them back home. He led them on straight road to go to the inhabited city. They shall give thanks to the Lord for his kindness and for his wonders to the children of men. We see that this psalm, which we recite on the day of our Independence Day, and that's what the rabbinate of Israel, the chief rabbinate of Israel, has decided that 107 is the psalm that we read on our holiday of independence, because understanding that the process of the returning back home is not something simple. It's not something that happens without challenges. There are challenges. There are challenges, very bitter challenges, very distressful challenges. But the prophecy is described here is that God's going to bring them to land, and the land will be redeemed. The people will be redeemed. The land that was so deserted for so many decades and centuries, and waited for the people of Israel to come back home. The land is waiting for us. The land is waiting for us. God is waiting for us. And he's waiting for us to praise him for the miracles. And even now, when we are sitting here in houses, in isolation because of the coronavirus, we know that God has the good things waiting for us ahead. We are going to become stronger after these days. We will have the ability to thank God and to tell the miracles to our next generation. And we will see events of biblical characteristics in front of our eyes. And we will be able to be those who are singing to God and giving Him eternal thanks. So now that we've concluded and celebrated the holiday of Passover, and we concluded it yesterday, and we're looking forward to celebrating our independence, to celebrating the unity of Jerusalem, to celebrating and to also marking and remembering our soldiers and our sanctified souls of those who were killed and murdered in the different concentration camps of the Holocaust. Together we take them and we look forward and we look ahead, and we won't forget them. But we also recall that God, from all this darkness, He brought the people of Israel back home. And He's bringing us a wonderful future. The state of Israel is flourishing like no other country in the world. And the return of the people of Israel back home to their homeland is a message of light to the nations. And that's what the final two sentences of this psalm in verses 42 and 43. The upright see and rejoice, and all injustice shuts his mouth. He who is wise will keep these in his mind, and they will ponder the kind deeds of the Lord. Those who are in justice will see these processes, and they won't be blind. They will understand that these are great days that we're living in. And those who are wise will keep this in their minds, and they will understand the great deeds of God. So as we are celebrating redemption, and we understand that there are obstacles on the way, we are thanking God for bringing us back home, for redeeming the land, for redeeming His people, and for allowing us to be a light upon all nations. Shalom from Jerusalem. We love you all. Hallelujah.